and hopefully you have remembered everything we've learned the last 12, 13 weeks. And actually I want to start with just a little bit of a review to get us to where we are. If you have the list of what we're studying which week, which I have some extras, but I didn't bring them. Hopefully you have that. But we have 2 more weeks of the Old Testament, this week and next week, and then we'll start on the New Testament. And so we've spent all of our first semester working our way through most of the Old Testament, and we have just a little bit left. But let's take I won't take too much time because we have Ezekiel and Daniel to talk about, but let's just kind of remember where we are in terms of the Old Testament. We started with Genesis, with the patriarchs, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, all those stories in Genesis of the patriarchs of Israel, which end with the Israelites going into Egypt to live, to escape famine. We turn the page to Exodus, and 430 years have passed, and instead of being guests, they're slaves. And we have the whole story of the Exodus. And all that takes up the book of Exodus with Moses. We have the time of the wandering in the desert because of the people's lack of faith and because of their rebelliousness. The 40 years of wandering, where the one generation dies and the new generation comes along. Moses dies, Joshua becomes the leader of the people, and they finally cross the Jordan River into the promised land, the land promised to Abraham way back in Genesis. And they begin to fight for the land because the land is occupied by the Canaanites and all the other ites. And we have a period that's referred to as the period of the Judges, where it's a very loose confederation of tribes. And those great stories of the judges like Gideon and Samson. The people finally demand a king, like all the other countries, all the other nations. God is not too happy about that because they say God believes in rejecting him by choosing a king. Instead of being a theocracy, a nation ruled by God, they want to be a monarchy. They start with a king, Saul. He doesn't work out very well. We have David. David that works out really well. His son Solomon works out pretty well. His son doesn't work out, Rehoboam. And under Rehoboam, the kingdom of the 12 tribes split into 2 nations. The southern kingdom of Judea, the northern kingdom retaining the name Israel. We have the period of the kings, where both nations are more often than not ruled by a bad king, fall into idolatry, fall into disobedience, fall into persecution by the surrounding nations. They'll occasionally cry out to the Lord. God sends prophets to continue to try to draw them back to God, but there's a cycle of disobedience that continues throughout the period of the kings until finally their disobedience leads to disaster. The northern tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel, is conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC and really not heard from again. The southern kingdom of Judea hangs in until 586 BC when they're conquered by the Babylonians and carted off into captivity. And all through those conquerings and captivities, there are always prophets trying to draw the people back to the Lord. And so the last few books of the Old Testament tend to be talking about that period either of the captivity, of the Babylonian exile, or the period of return, primarily Ezra and Nehemiah. And remembering that the Old Testament the books of the Old Testament are not chronological. We talked about that the very first couple of weeks. Our Western minds, we would think, well, of course you would organize the books chronologically. That's not the way those who put the Bible together thought. They thought you put the large books at the beginning and the short books at the end. And that's what they did. Which is why when you read through this later parts of the Old Testament, you're jumping back and forth in time because they put the longer books ahead of the shorter books. And so you may, oh, this book's taking place during the kingdom. Oh, now we're in the exile. Oh, now we're in the return. Well, now we're back in the exile again. And you have to always kind of, if your Bible hopefully has some sort of introduction at the beginning, a page that at least tells you what period of time you're talking about, it's helpful. But we follow the order of books of the Jewish Bible, and I think there have been people who have taken the books of the Bible and rearranged them into a chronological order. You can buy a Bible that does that, but the traditional order is the one that we have in almost every Bible. So tonight we're going to look at Ezekiel and Daniel, and we're probably more familiar with Daniel, because Daniel has those stories that have been dramatized and talked about more. Ezekiel, not as probably familiar to us as Daniel is. Ezekiel is a long book, coming in between Lamentations and Daniel. Ezekiel has what, 48 chapters. So Ezekiel's a pretty long book, and it's full of weird imagery. Just to be honest, there's some odd, weird imagery in Ezekiel. We're going to see in both Ezekiel and Daniel imagery that will kind of remind us of the book of Revelation. As a matter of fact, when we come, way at the end of the spring, when we finally come to the book of Revelation, we'll start to see similarities between Revelation and Daniel and Ezekiel. Visions of weird creatures that is a part of Revelation, that's a part of these books as well. There is a name for this kind of literature, the kind of literature that we find in Ezekiel and Daniel and in the book of Revelation. It's usually called apocalyptic literature, as in the word apocalypse. The word apocalypse means unveiling. We hear the word apocalypse and we think end of the world, is what the word apocalypse means. But that's not what the word apocalypse means. It means an uncovering or an unveiling. So apocalyptic literature is about unveiling mysteries, uncovering mysteries, often with very odd symbolic imagery to convey the message. So let's talk about Ezekiel. And we don't know a lot about Ezekiel except that he's a priest and that his journey or his life occurs during the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. And just to, again, remind us about the Babylonian captivity. We have the southern kingdom of Judea, which is still ruled by descendants of David. And they escape barely being conquered by Assyria, like their northern cousins. When Assyria conquers the north, the south is threatened, but the south is not conquered by Assyria. They hold on for another 150 years. But when Babylon becomes the dominant empire of the region, remember Babylon is basically Iraq. When Babylon becomes the dominant empire of the region, they begin to lay siege to other nations, especially little old Israel, which is not a very powerful nation by this time. And they begin to have some success, and some of the captives of Judea are actually taken into captivity in Babylon before the utter destruction of Jerusalem. It doesn't all just occur in 586 BC. The Babylonian siege against Judea is a multi-year process. It culminates in 586 when they break down the walls of Jerusalem, when they destroy the temple, etc., etc. But it's an ongoing military campaign. And so Ezekiel is one of the first Jews taken into captivity by the Babylonians, even before the fall of Jerusalem. So this book starts with him in Babylon as a captive or as an exile, but it's before the final fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem does occur later on in the book of Ezekiel. He gets word that the city is fallen. but that's not the case when the story begins, or when the book begins. So it says here, just looking at, I'm not going to read obviously all of it, in Ezekiel 1:1 gives us the time, in the 30th year, the 4th month of the 5th day, and he is at the Kebar River, which is part of the Babylonian Empire. And he said it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, which is one of the kings of Judea who, again, is brought into exile before the final fall of Jerusalem. Ezekiel the priest was there by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. And the hand of the Lord is upon him. And what happens now is Ezekiel has a vision. And the vision is weird. So let's just read a little bit about what this vision looks like. I looked, this is verse 4, 1:4. I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on the 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They didn't turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox, and also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and the wings covered its body. Each one went straight ahead. Whenever the spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. And the appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. And the creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. Then it goes on to say that they are wheels underneath each of these creatures. So I am no artist, but I've seen drawings of this. I thought about I couldn't really find it very good. And what's fascinating is if you Google an image of this, like an artistic rendition of what he is describing here, every one of them looks totally different. It's like the description, as the artist tries to take what he says and paint it or draw it, every drawing I found looked different. But, there's 4 creatures, okay? And they're forming a square. And they have wings. Okay? And the wings are touching each other. And they have 4 faces on each one, okay? And you have to turn the whole thing this way. And they're on wheels. And so you got 4 creatures in a square, and each one of them has 4 faces, and they have wings, and the wings touching each other form kind of a square. And all of this, and they're on wheels, so they're moving around. And all of that to say, on top of this, there's a throne. Okay, so jump down to verse 22. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out towards the other. Each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. And when they stood still, they lowered their wings. There came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. And above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire. And high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire. And that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant lights surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So all these creatures with their wings on the wheels, and above them is a throne, and above on the throne is a figure like a man, except like fire, like glowing metal, like radiance. And he says it is like the appearance of a rainbow. He says it was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So this is an image of God's throne. That's what he's getting around to. It's an image of God's throne. That God's throne sits above these living creatures who are kind of these weird amalgamations. But remember, often this kind of literature, and we'll talk about this several months from now when we get to Revelation, the different kinds of animals and the number of wings and the number of faces are all symbolic. Like, the four winds and different animals, like an eagle is an animal of the air, and an ox is a beast of burden, and a lion is the king of the jungle, and a human is the ruler of the planet. And I mean, all the things are meant to symbolize the vastness of creation and the diversity of creation. And I'm not sure they ever tried to draw this or paint this, because of course for the Jews, any image of God was forbidden. That's part of the second commandment. You shall not make an image of God. So you won't find in synagogues paintings of God. You won't find any attempt to paint what God looks like. But these descriptions here, it was like wings and faces and fire and rainbows. This is some attempt to just talk about this overwhelming grandeur of God that he has. And that leads us into these messages that we are told. He's told. And it gets stranger than that. I mean, Ezekiel is told to be a prophet of God in Babylon. And the first readers of this, one of the first things they'd be amazed by is, wait a minute, he's in Babylon and he's seeing a vision of Yahweh, the God of Israel. What's the God of Israel doing in Babylon? Because they still thought very regionally. God would only appear in Israel. That God wouldn't appear in Babylon. But here God is appearing to him in Babylon and giving him this message of warning. And part of the message is what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And there are many times what Ezekiel is told to do is to prophesy, but not with words, with an action. And to do something the only thing I can think to compare it to is street theater. Have you ever been around people doing street theater? Doing acting out something in an outdoor venue. It's probably not as popular as it used to be. When I was living in California, there was a place called Venice Beach. Have you ever heard of Venice Beach? And if you went to Venice Beach in California, there was all kinds of street performers doing all kinds of weird stuff. I mean, just odd things. And what Ezekiel is told to do is to act out these messages, not verbally, but with almost like a little pantomime. And so I'll give you an example of what he's asked to do, or what he's told to do. Chapter 4. This is God telling Ezekiel to act out a prophecy. So Ezekiel 4. Now, son of man, take a clay tablet, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it. Erect siege works against it. Build a ramp up to it. Set up camps against it. And put battering rams around it. Then take an iron pan and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and turn your face toward it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the house of Israel. Okay? So it's, in other words, instead of saying, Jerusalem's going to be knocked down and wiped out, he's not going to say it. He's going to build a little model of Jerusalem, a little miniature of Jerusalem with walls and ramparts and things, and like look what's going to happen, but it's going to be acted out instead of spoken. And it gets honor. Then, here's the fun part, is like, of all the prophets, you don't want to be Ezekiel. Okay? Here's why you don't want to be Ezekiel. Then lie on your left side and put the sin of the house of Israel upon yourself. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side. I've assigned you the same number of days as the number of years of their sin. So for 390 days you will bear the sin of the house of Israel. After you finish this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the house of Judah. I've assigned you 40 days, 1 day for each year. Then turn your face towards the siege of Jerusalem, and with bared arm prophesy against her. I'll tie you up with ropes, so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you finish the days of your siege. Doesn't that sound like a great assignment? Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You're to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of a hin of water and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a barley cake. Bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel.
Yeah.
The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations, or I will drive them. And I said, what? What? No, he doesn't say it. Then I said, not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now, I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No unclean meat has ever entered my mouth. Very well, he said. I'll let you bake your bread over cow manure instead of human excrement. Okay. So, okay, as long as it's cow manure, I'll be all right then. He said to me, Son of man, I'll cut off the supply of food in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair. Food and water will be scarce. They'll be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away because of their sin. Okay. So, this is a way to communicate what's going to happen to Jerusalem, but in a very dramatic way, and obviously for Ezekiel, a very unpleasant way to get this message out. You know, and you want, of course, I want to say, well, now, do you get breaks in that? Or, I mean, laying on your side for 390 days, you know, is that 24/7? Is that like in shifts? I mean, I would have all kinds of questions about this. But, you know, those aren't given here. But this is the kind of thing Ezekiel does. He acts out prophecies to convey to the other exiles there about what is going to happen to Jerusalem, what's going to happen to the holy city. Now, that's just one, and we won't read all of the rather odd acted parables that he does. But chapter 10 is where he has a vision, and the vision is of this same throne. Okay? This same throne of God. And chapter 10, it has a very similar description of the living creatures and the angels and all that. It's not identical to that first one, but it's very similar to this image of the throne of God. But the pertinent verses are 10, starting at verse 18. Because remember, this is representing God's throne. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple, and stopped above the cherubim. And that's angels, remember. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the Lord was above them. And these were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel at the Kebar River. In other words, the same ones. And the message is, this throne of God, he has a vision of the throne of God above the temple in Jerusalem, leaving. In other words, what would that symbolize? Yeah. Yeah. God has basically abandoned the temple in Jerusalem. Therefore, it's going to be destroyed. God has left the building. God has left the temple. And because God has left the temple, that glorious temple of Solomon there in Jerusalem is about to be destroyed, which of course is exactly what happens when the Babylonians come and destroy the temple in Jerusalem. So the imagery there, the vision there is of God leaving Jerusalem, and he says it's the same vision I saw of God in Babylon. So in some ways, God is now traveling with the exiles into Babylon. So after this sad and sort of very harsh sort of things, we have a little bit of hope in the end of chapter 11:16. He says to Ezekiel, "Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I'll give you back the land of Israel again. They'll return to it and remove all of its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh." Now, some translations, instead of saying undivided heart, probably say pure heart, because that's what the word pure actually means in Hebrew. Undivided. Pure means undivided. So this is a word saying, yes, the people are going into exile because of their unfaithfulness, because of their unwillingness to stay true to the covenant, because of their worship of foreign gods and all their other sins of injustice and mistreating of widows and orphans and on and on and on. They're going into exile, but there will be a return. And he's saying when they come back, they'll clean up their act. They'll get rid of the idols. They'll get rid of all that other stuff. And they will have new hearts. Instead of a heart of stone, a heart of flesh. A pure heart and a new spirit. And so that imagery, is in the Psalms as well. Psalm 22, when David says, create in me a clean heart, O Lord, and renew your right spirit within me. That idea of God changing the heart. From a heart of stone, a heart that is so hard that God can't penetrate it, to a heart of flesh, a softer heart. So there's a little bit of a promise there in chapter 11. Then there's a whole lot of judgment. And I'm not going to go all that, but if you look at just what's happening in the next several chapters, it's about sort of image after image of God's judgment about his people having been unfaithful. He compares them to a burnt up stick and a vine that's been cut off, and to prostitutes who have gone after, instead of staying true to their husband, have gone after other lovers, and on and on and on. Lots of different imagery of this unfaithfulness. And some of it is done in poetry, and some of it's done in prose. And then it turns from judgment on Israel to a few chapters about judgment on other nations. And we find in chapter like 25, judgment on the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Philistines, 26, Tyre, 29 against Egypt, 30 more about Egypt, a lament for Pharaoh in 32. So these are, this is various words against all these other nations and all their sins. We finally get to chapter 33. Chapter 33, I said this is all before the actual fall. Chapter 33, verse 21. In the 12th year of our exile, so he's been in Babylon 12 years now. In the 10th month of the 5th day, a man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, "The city has fallen." Now the evening before the man arrived, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he opened my mouth before the man came to me in the morning. My mouth was open, and I was no longer silent. The word of the Lord came to me, "Son of man, the people living in those ruins in the land of Israel are saying, Abraham was only one man, yet he possessed the land. We're many, surely the land has been given to us as our possession. Therefore say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord said. Since you eat meat with the blood still in it, and look to your idols and shed blood, should you possess the land? You rely on your sword, you do detestable things. Each of you defiles his neighbor's wife. Should you then possess the land? Say this to them. This is what the sovereign Lord says. As surely as I live, those who are left in the ruins will fall by the sword. Those out in the country I'll give to the wild animals to be devoured. Those in the strongholds and the caves will die of a plague. I'll make the land desolate, waste. Her proud strength will come to an end. The mountains of Israel will become desolate. No one will cross them. Then they'll know that I am the Lord, when I've made the land a desolate waste because of all of the detestable things that you have done. So, this is not a cheerful book. This is a book of all of Israel's sins and all their apostasy and idolatry, their treatment of the neighbor, the treatment of the poor, their treatment of the widow, their treatment of the orphan, the treatment of the stranger. Their sin is all fallen back on their heads now. Now, if there's one image in the book of Ezekiel that, I said this is not as familiar a book as what is the one image in the book of Ezekiel that we probably have all heard about?
Dry bones.
The Valley of the Dry Bones. Right, chapter 37. It's probably the only story out of Ezekiel that a lot of people have ever heard. The Valley of the Dry Bones. So this is an image, after all this judgment and destruction, after all of this saying, it's going to be desolate, it's going to be destroyed, there's going to be wild beasts, all this gloom and doom, we start to see at the end of the book the promise of return, the promise of hope, the promise that this punishment won't last forever and this exile won't last forever, that there's going to be hope, that there's going to be a return. And so this chapter 37 is one of the great imageries of the Old Testament. So Ezekiel says in chapter 37, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, O sovereign Lord, you alone know. He said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I'll make breath enter you, and you'll come to life. I'll attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover your skin. I'll put breath in you, and you'll come to life. And you'll know that I'm the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. As I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound. And the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and the tendons and the flesh appeared on them, and the skin covered them. But there was no breath in them. He said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. He said to me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We're cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, O my people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I'll bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I'm the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I'll put my spirit in you and you'll live, and I'll settle you in your own land, and you'll know that I am the Lord. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I've done it, declares the Lord. Why do we know that of all the things in Ezekiel?
Song.
Because of the song, right? What? Foot bone's connected to the leg bone, and the leg bone's connected to the knee bone, and the knee bone's connected to the other bone. Hear the word of the Lord. Right? On and on and on. Dim bones, dim bones, dim. Dry bones, dim bones, dim bones, dim. Dry bones, dim bones, dim bones, dim. Dry bones. Hear the word of the Lord. Has everybody heard that song?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Does everybody know that it came from Ezekiel 37? Where did you think it came from? Huh? 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 Did you know that it was connected to the Bible?
Yeah.
I did. I learned something tonight.
Yeah, and of course the way it's, if you sung it the way it's originally, dim bones, dim bones, dim, it is a Negro spiritual. It's one of it was sung first by Negro slaves.
Yeah.
And it's a Negro spiritual that was then eventually became into the mainstream and sung by the white people as well. But yeah, I mean, this song, probably not sung as much as it was maybe when I was a kid, but, sung as a kid's song, and, I guess a song to teach you what part of your, what's connected to what, But, maybe the clue is, hear the word of the Lord, that you think, okay, this isn't just a song about bones, this is a biblical vision from Ezekiel. And he says, come from the four winds. Do you remember something I said way back in Genesis about wind and breath? What's the? I don't expect you to remember the Hebrew. Anybody remember what the word for wind is in Hebrew?
Ruach.
Ruach. Yeah. Is the word for wind. What's the word for breath in Hebrew? Ruach. What's the word for spirit in Hebrew? Ruach. The Hebrew word ruach can be translated one of three ways. The word ruach can be translated as wind, or breath, or spirit. So, when you read this passage, you realize that the word that's being used each time when he says, I'll put ruach in you. And he said, then come from the four ruachs, O ruach, and breathe into these. And and then in verse 14, I'll put my ruach in you. So in my translation, it uses three different words. It uses the word wind, it uses the word spirit, it uses the word breath. But in the Hebrew, it's all the same word every time. So the idea, and so these lifeless bodies coming back to life, What story does that remind us of? I would say Adam. Remember? Adam's a mud man until God does what? Breathes on him. It's the breath that brings Adam to life. He's a man made out of mud. You talk about the old songs. We say 16 tons. People say a man is made out of mud. The coal miner is made out of muscle and blood. Anyway, but a man made out of mud, that's from the book of Genesis. God makes a man a mud man and breathes the ruach into him, and he becomes an ish, a man. That's Hebrew for ish is a Hebrew for a man. Isha is woman, and ish and isha, man and woman, are created in that parable, in that story from Genesis. So, Valley of the Dry Bones, and the book does end at least with a somewhat happier note. If after all, chapter after chapter of gloom and doom, chapter 43, looking to the future, chapter 43, Ezekiel has a vision of a new temple. 43:1. And he has a guide guiding him through this vision of a new temple. The man brought me to the gate facing east, and I saw the glory of the Lord coming from the east. Where's the glory of the Lord coming from? Coming from the east. What's east of Israel? Babylon. Coming from the east. Coming back. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters. The land was radiant with his glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions I had seen by the Kebar River. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So this is the idea. We earlier had in chapter 10, God leaving the temple. Now here in chapter 43, we have God coming back to the temple, coming back from the east. So Ezekiel has some bright spots, but it's not. I say it's a book of judgment and a book kind of a gloom and doom in a lot of ways. So you probably didn't know as much about Ezekiel as you did about Daniel. So let's turn to Daniel, the very next book. Daniel we know because of some of the really cool stories in it that have been dramatized and told and retold. And this too takes place during the Babylonian captivity. And when the Babylonians conquered Judea, they took the best people, the best families, the wealthiest, the most educated people is the ones that they carried off into exile. Because they thought they would make the best workers and the best servants. They took the cream of the crop of the people of Judea. And so when we open the book of Daniel, it's the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim in Judah. But Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. He carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put the treasure in the house of his God. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the great, in terms of power and legend, great kings of Babylon. I remember way back when Saddam Hussein was still in power in Iraq, there were coins. On one side of the coin, Saddam Hussein. On the other side of the coin, Nebuchadnezzar. So, in other words, Saddam Hussein equating himself with this great conqueror, this great emperor of Babylon. So, Nebuchadnezzar conquers Judea and carries off many of the, they don't just wreck the temple. First they take all the good stuff out of it. All the gold and silver and bronze and all the valuables are taken out of the temple and then they destroy it. They take all that stuff to Babylon. Verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So this is, I say, they take the cream of the crop of the Judeans to bring them into service of Nebuchadnezzar, service in the palace. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service, civil service. Among these were some men from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But the chief officer gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. That's funny. We usually refer to Daniel as Daniel, his Hebrew name. But we usually refer to his 3 friends not by their Jewish names, but by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're put on a diet to fatten them up and make them healthy, from the king's table. What's wrong with that for a Jewish boy? It's not kosher. It's not kosher food from the king's table. So, verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. God caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord and king who's assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king will have my head because of you. If I don't feed you well, and you don't look good, if you look skinny and weak, it'll be my head. So Daniel has a proposition. Daniel said to the guard, who the chief official had appointed over the guys, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Compare our appearance to that of the young men who eat the royal food. Treat your servants in accordance with what you see. He agrees to this and tests them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine and gave them vegetables instead. So there you go. Here's what the Bible says: be a vegetarian. But this has nothing to do. This has nothing to do with. In Daniel's mind, this is not about their health. This is about their obedience to God. This is about them not being defiled by eating non-kosher food. So he goes on to say, these are the top of the class. These guys are great. They're smart. They're able, and they end up going into the service of the king. Now, in the 2nd chapter, it says Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And it says in verse 2, he calls in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to come in and help him with this. And he says, and I think this is kind of a funny exchange. He says, verse 3, I've had a dream that troubles me. I want to know what it means. Okay, well that's what the magicians and the soothsayers and all that was part of what they did. They interpret dreams. And so the astrologers said, "Oh, king, live forever. Tell your servant the dream and we'll interpret it." The king said to the astrologers, "This is what I firmly decided. If you don't tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut into pieces and your bones turned into piles of rubble. If you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they said, Well, let the king tell his servants the dream and we'll interpret it. He said, I'm certain you're trying to gain time. In other words, you're stalling. You realize this is not what I've decided. If you don't tell me the dream, there's just one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. Now, tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can interpret it. So, he's putting these guys, he said, I had a dream last night.
What was it?
What was it? And tell me what it means. Yeah, well, tell us the dream, we'll tell you what it means. No. You tell me what I dreamt. You're the magician, you're the soothsayer. You tell me what I dreamed and what it means. And they're like, well, okay. And then they finally say in verse 10, the astrologers answered the king, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And they don't live among men. Like, what you are asking is impossible. It's impossible. So, he executes them. Which you think, is that, you know. And, well, actually, he issues the order to execute them. And he's about to put him to death when Daniel, who's risen to be a servant of the king, he says, now, you know, why is this happening? And they explain to him. And Daniel goes back and they pray about it. And basically, Daniel goes to him and says, don't kill him. Take me the king. I'll do what he asks. Because he's asked God to reveal this to him. So, they say, bring Daniel. He says, we found a guy who can do what you ask. And the king asked Daniel, can you really do this? And Daniel replies, verse 27, 2:27. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. And he goes on to tell him his dream, which is of a statue that is made of different types of material. There's a statue, verse 31. The head of the statue, actually verse 32. The head of the statue is gold, the chest and the arms are silver, the belly and the thighs are bronze, and the legs are iron. And, you know, he talks about how this statue is made of these things, and then he says, now here's the interpretation. Verse 37. You, O king, are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he's placed mankind, the beasts of the field, birds of the air, wherever they live, he's made you ruler. You're the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, it'll crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, this will be a divided kingdom. It'll have some of the strength of iron, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than the iron mixes with clays. And then on and on and on. What little phrase do we get from this? Feet of clay. Yeah. Someone has feet of clay. That comes from this. But the idea is, this is the image of four kingdoms. Babylonian kingdom and then three other kingdoms that will follow. Well, the three empires that follow, Babylon is succeeded by Persia. Persia is succeeded by Greece. Greece is succeeded by Rome. And so, most people believe that that's what these four kingdoms are representing. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. But yeah, the statue with the feet of clay, again, comes into our language. Now, to the stories that you probably know the best. Chapter 3. Speaking of statues, Nebuchadnezzar makes a statue of himself. Chapter 3. 90 feet high. Okay, as tall as a 9-story building. Right, so think about that. A statue that's 9 stories high, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and puts it up, and he says to all of his muckety-mucks, and this repeated every time, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, etc., all these people, that they are to worship this statue. Verse 4. This is what you're to do, O people, nations of men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. And so, they issue this decree. Well, verse 8, at this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. And they basically say, you issued this order that everybody worships this statue. Verse 12, there are some Jews you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who don't pay attention to you. They don't serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. They're not towing the line. They're not bowing down to the statue when they blow the horn. And so, these three have come into the civil service, are working in the palace, so he calls them in and basically says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that when you hear all these instruments, that you are not falling down? Because you remember, the order is do that or you get thrown into the furnace. In verse 15, then what God will rescue you? And their answer is, well, we know the rule, but our God can save us, and even if he doesn't, we're still not going to do it. So, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude towards them changed. They had been, he kind of liked them. They were good servants. So, he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. Which, I don't know how you do that, really, but... and commanded them to tie him up and throw him in. And so that's what they do. 21, these men wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes were bound and thrown into the furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the furnace. In verse 24, King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw in the fire? Certainly, O king. Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And he approaches and shouts down to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Oh, they come out of the fire. And it says, they saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes weren't scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. They don't even smell like smoke. So Nebuchadnezzar then says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. And he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province. So this is the story of as it's usually called, the fiery furnace, as it says in the Old King James. Think about that fourth person there. People speculate about that fourth figure. What have you heard about that fourth figure?
Either Jesus or Michael or Gabriel or.
It said the Son of God.
Yeah.
Not
I actually
Jesus.
think Jesus.
Yeah, I think it was Jesus.
Some people have said, some people said Jesus, an angel. It's not spelled out, but there is definitely a protection there that, and this story is an encouragement, of course, to Jews who were tempted to give in, bow down to false gods, to compromise their faith. Here's a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. Let me read a couple of paragraphs about Nebuchadnezzar. At the time, Nebuchadnezzar, the world's most powerful man, had reason to be proud. He captained the mighty Babylonian army on its march through the Middle East, annihilating all opposition, demanding tribute. No one could withstand him. The kingdom of Judah, vastly reduced by previous wars, was just one small country among many that sent money and captives to try to appease this tyrant. Ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, dragged its remaining citizens into exile, and Jews still look back on that time as one of the darkest periods of Jewish history. On the home front, Nebuchadnezzar went on a lavish building campaign. He decorated the sacred procession way with 120 lions flanking its length for nearly a mile. He adorned the Ishtar Gate with enameled brickwork depicting 575 dragons and bulls. He built spectacular palaces and temples, also the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The book of Daniel, however, shows him in a different light, a vulnerable man who needed to recognize the King of Kings. Some of the hapless Jews whom Nebuchadnezzar carried into exile became his trusted officials. Through them, and through a humiliating but God-given bout of insanity, Nebuchadnezzar came to terms with his pride, learned his lesson while living out in the field like an animal. And that's the next part here in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream that Daniel interprets. And I won't read the whole dream, but here's Daniel's interpretation. 4:24. The interpretation, O king, this is the decree of the Most High is issued against my lord the king. You'll be driven away from people and live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives commands. So he's going to go nuts for a while. And then we say, sure enough, a year later, he's walking, admiring his palace, and says, verse 30, 4:30, isn't this the great Babylon I've built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Verse 31, while the words were still on his lips, when a voice said, this is what was decreed for you, Nebuchadnezzar. And it repeats what Daniel had said, and he goes nuts for a while. And is eating grass, and his hair grows, and his fingernails grow, and then finally he comes to his senses. But he is humbled in this by God. Now, 2 other stories, one of which you know well, and one of which you might not know as well, but again, you've heard the phrase that comes from it. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son Belshazzar becomes king. And that's where we take up in chapter 5 with Belshazzar. King Belshazzar, chapter 5, had a great banquet for the thousands of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. So these are the goblets that had been used by the priests. These are the sacred things that were part of the temple what's the word I'm looking for? Utensils, I guess you'd say, that were taken out of the temple of Jerusalem. They've now been stored in Babylon, and Belshazzar decides to have a party and use them for the guests for their drinking party. So that the kings and nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. They brought them in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, and his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Verse 4, 5:4. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Hence the phrase,
Writing on the wall.
the handwriting is on the wall. See, you learned something else, didn't you? Did you know that was from the Bible? The handwriting is on the wall. Well, a human hand appears and starts writing, which is pretty creepy. I mean, just a disembodied hand writing on the wall. So he calls in all of his, wise men and other assorted, guys that are supposed to understand mysteries. And verse 7, he calls out for his enchanters, astrologers, diviners. Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around his neck. And they come in, but they can't understand it. And then the queen comes in and she says, I know somebody who can interpret this. He served your father. Verse 11, there's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man, Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding and ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel. He'll tell you what the writing means. Okay, so they remember now by this time Daniel's getting up in years. So they call for Daniel and they bring him out, and here's what's on the wall. It's verse 25. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson. This is Aramaic. This isn't Hebrew, this is Aramaic. As a matter of fact, Daniel is one of the few books in the Old Testament that part of the book is not in Hebrew, part of the book is in Aramaic. And what's the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic? All the languages of the Middle East are from a common family. In the same way that French and Italian and Latin, I mean, they all share roots. They all go back to Latin and Greek roots. If you know Latin, you can pick up a lot of Spanish, Italian, French, etc. So those languages all come from the same family of languages. Well, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, other Middle Eastern languages also all share a lot of common root words. And so Aramaic is a language that is closely similar to Hebrew. I guess that Aramaic is to Hebrew as Italian is to Latin. Does that make sense? Italian and Latin are very similar, but people in Italy would have a hard time reading Latin, even though it's very similar to Italian. And it's derived from Latin. Well, Aramaic is derived from Hebrew. And by the time of Jesus, I've probably said this before, when Jesus was talking to his disciples and talking to Jewish people, Jesus spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic. These words are in Aramaic. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson. And it says, verse 26, this is what the words mean. Mene. Mene is the Aramaic word that means numbered. Numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel is the Aramaic word that means weighed. Not like weighed in a pool, like weighed on the scales. Okay? You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres. Peres means divided. Okay? Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So the handwriting on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, is your days are numbered, you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and your kingdom is going to be divided between the Medes and the Persians. This is, remember, the next empire that follows behind the Babylonian Empire is the Persian Empire. So, even though the message is kind of a negative message, they give Daniel the award for solving the riddle. But then the very next verse, verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Little note here: two empires, the empires of the Medes and the Persians, joined forces to overthrow Babylon. And the way they did it was they actually diverted the Euphrates River, marched on the dry riverbed, and sieged the city walls of ancient Babylon, the ancient capital of Babylon. The ancient capital of Babylon is about 50 miles from Baghdad. So the Medes and the Persians, right after this, conquer Babylon. So now Daniel is in the service of the Persians. Daniel continues in civil service even with the regime change. And by this time, scholars estimate he's like perhaps as old as 80 years old at this point, Daniel. So, but he's still working as an administrator at the palace, still working as a civil servant. And it says he is risen to a pretty high place. 6:4. It says, because he's risen to such a high place, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. They were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him. He was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So, people trying to undermine another official to get his job and chop him down, that would never happen today. People trying to find dirt on somebody else so they can undermine them, that would never happen in the modern political system or any kind of government office today. Surely not. So he's like, well, he's not corrupt. You can't catch him on any corruption. He's efficient. We can't catch him on incompetence. So we're going to have to go after his religion. That's the only way we're going to be able to remove it. So they go to Darius and they said, Darius, you ought to issue an edict that says for the next month, nobody can worship anyone except you. All prayers, all worship has to be directed to you. We think that would be a great way to celebrate your greatness, is if you issue an order, for the next 30 days, only you can be worshipped, only you can be prayed to. And, most kings and rulers and monarchs and emperors, when people come to them with flattery and say, you're so wonderful, everybody ought to worship you, people go, oh, well, yeah, that's a great idea. So he agrees. Well, as soon as he agrees and puts it in writing, they know that Daniel has a practice. And Daniel's practice is, verse 10, it says, he heard about the decree, he went home, opened his windows to Jerusalem, and he did what he did every day. 3 times a day he got down to his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God as he had done all his life. So he can't go to the temple. He's in Babylon. He can't go worship God in the temple. The temple by this time is not even there. It's been destroyed. He can't worship in his home, but he does what he can do, which is turn towards Jerusalem 3 times a day and pray to God. But his political enemies know he does this. So they catch him in the act of praying to God. Then, verse 12, they went to the king and spoke to him about the royal decree. Didn't you publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or man except you would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king's like, well, yeah, I signed that law. And they're like, whoa, well, that guy Daniel who works for you, well, he broke the law. And the king now he's already said, yes, that's what I said. He is caught. He can't lose face. They say, well, you signed it. You can't take it back now. So he's like, all right. Bring Daniel and throw him in with the lions. But he doesn't really, his heart's not in it. Notice he says in verse 16, the king gave the order. They brought Daniel, threw him in the lion's den. He said to Daniel, may your God whom you serve rescue you. So they throw him into this pit full of lions, put a rock over the hole that they threw him down. And then it says, verse 18, the king returned to the palace, spent the night without eating and without any entertainment. He couldn't sleep. He's worried about Daniel. So verse 19, the first light of dawn, the king got up, hurried to the lion den. He came near them and called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel. He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, O king. Remember, I've been loyal, even though you've thrown me in air. The king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and their children, which is like, wow. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations and men of every language, may you prosper greatly. I issued a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. He's the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues, he saves, he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He's rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus is the one who was going to eventually allow the exiles to come back. So Daniel's life spans, he's a very young man when he's brought into captivity. He lives all the way through the rise of Cyrus, who's the one who ends the captivity. So he's got to be about 90 when he died. The rest of the book, after these great stories, well, great, not for the wives and children of those guys, but these stories of the lion's den and the handwriting on the wall and the fiery furnace and all that, the rest of the book of Daniel is more like Ezekiel. It's visions, and some of them are visions that are similar to the ones in Ezekiel, and some of them kind of repeat this idea of the four kingdoms that are coming. The idea there's going to be 4 kingdoms, with the last one being this kingdom of iron. And so I'm not going to really go into all of that because it's very similar to what we've already read in Ezekiel and some of what we already read. But the same kind of what we would call apocalyptic literature. Weird imagery that's similar to Ezekiel, is similar to Revelation, of weird creatures with different faces and wings and animals, all of it talking about how the judgment will come on these kingdoms. Eventually God will restore his people. and there will eventually be a return. And you'll even see at the end of Daniel, they talk about Michael, the archangel will be a part of all this. When we get to Revelation, we may come back to Daniel and Ezekiel a little bit and compare some of those passages and how they parallel one another with this weird imagery, at least weird to us. But as I think, well, it's not original to me, some of this weird imagery to us was very meaningful to the original audience. And the best analogy I ever read, as I say it's not original to me, is think about a lot of the imagery in books like Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation. Think about it like a political cartoon. Because think about, if you are an immigrant to America and you don't know anything about America, you don't know anything about, our imagery or our symbolism, and you've learned, you're brand new, and you open up a newspaper, and there's the political cartoon, and it's a donkey and an elephant fighting. You go, what is this? Why is the donkey fighting the elephant? What does that even mean? Why is this donkey and this elephant fighting? Or why are this donkey and this elephant are having a tug of war? What? This is a weird image, a donkey fighting an elephant? I don't understand it. Now, we understand it, don't we? Why do we understand it?
We know what they mean.
Because we know what they mean. We know what the symbols mean. We know, the donkey represents this political party, and the elephant represents this political party. And we read meaning into this picture of two animals fighting. But somebody who doesn't understand the American political system, all they see is a picture of a donkey and an elephant. Or, during the Cold War, an eagle fighting a bear.
Yeah.
Why is this eagle fighting this bear? Well, this is Russia, and this, but you have to have the key. You have to have to understand the weird imagery of why these animals are fighting each other. And think about political cartoons and how they symbolize countries or politics or whatever, and you see, you see a caricature and you see, there's a skinny guy with a stovepipe hat. What does that mean? It means Abraham Lincoln. it doesn't even have to look like him. You just put him in a dark coat and a tall hat and people, that's Lincoln. Or whatever, because you got to understand the key. And when we read books like Daniel or Revelation and we see these, and they had four faces and wings and fire and wheels and sometimes we understand the context because we've understood from other parts of the scripture, and we understand from historians and scholars and literature from other countries. Sometimes we can decipher those images. Sometimes we can't. And sometimes TV evangelists interpret it totally out of whole cloth with no clue what they're talking about. And write books about it means that this is going to happen and this is going to happen, and which remind me, there are hundreds of books have been written about interpreting Revelation that have all turned out to be wrong. Probably the one that I've mentioned before, that there was a book that came out in 1986 or 85, 86, and the title of the book was 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. 88 reasons. 88 reasons from the Bible why the rapture will occur in 1988. Well, 1988 came. 1988 went. And that book went into the bargain, marked down to, 50 cents. And there's, lots of people try to interpret some of these things that are in these apocalyptic books, and they think they've got it all figured out. And, for thousands of years, they've all been wrong. And from the late great planet Earth and on, they've all been wrong. That's about it. Well, now next week's going to be my biggest challenge. Okay, we're going to because in the Hebrew Bible, this is one book. It's called the Minor Prophets, and it's one book in the Hebrew Bible. In our Bible, it's 12 books, but they're all very short. They're called the Minor Prophets. As I say, in the Jewish Bible, it's only one book. Because they're all 12 little short books. But they're called minor prophets, not because they were unimportant or because they were, you know, short or something. It's just because they're very short books. And the Bible ends with them because the Bible is organized by length of book. So we'll with those 12 minor prophets, we'll probably obviously only spend a few 5 or 10 minutes on each one. And that will finish the Old Testament. And 2 weeks from tonight, we'll get to the Gospel. Which probably after some of the gloom and doom that we've read about the last tonight will be nice and refreshing. So why don't we pray?